Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the Formula 1 race ratings for the 2023 Miami Grand Prix. So hello and welcome to the race rating series. This is one of two series I do following each race, one the honoured review looking at the weekend as a whole, and this one looking more particularly at the drivers' performances and how they've done during the race on Sunday. Now if you do enjoy that series or this one, please make sure to give the video a thumbs up and go get yourself subscribed for more of both content throughout the season. Also, as this series is kind of going through a little bit of a change, please do leave any suggestions you have down below in the comments. Now with that out of the way, let's get into it. So, after 57 laps of watching 19 drivers attempt to beat Max Verstappen, we did reach the checkered flag for the Miami Grand Prix, with Max taking home his third win of the season, and for fifth for Red Bull this year, with him and Checo alternating first place throughout the first five races. In second place is Checo, who put up a bit of a fight, but ultimately never really looked like he was going to take the win once we got about halfway through, and we saw that Max was, well, just quicker. In third place, back on the podium after an unusually low finish of fourth last time out, is Fernando Alonso, with George Russell, the lead Mercedes, coming home in fourth, having had a race where he managed not to collide with anyone. In fifth place then, we have Carlos Sainz, the lead Ferrari. I mean, he did start 4 places ahead of his teammate, but hey, they don't ask how, they ask how many. In sixth place is Lewis Hamilton, after he turned into Lance Stroll for qualifying on the Saturday, starting down in 13th place. In behind him in 7th was Charles Leclerc, starting in 7th, finishing in 7th because he's in a Ferrari. Then down in 8th we have Pierre Gasly, best of the rest, as you can see, with Ocon in 9th, his teammate. Gasly continuing his run of impressive form, minus destroying both cars in Australia. And then in 10th place, rounding out the top 10, is Kevin Magnussen in the Haas car. Onto the race itself, and first things first, I'd say it was better than last year, though that's not really anything special. Perez kept the lead into turn 1, unlike in Saudi Arabia where Alonso got by, and from there no one ever really looked like challenging the Red Bull in the front, or in fact the Red Bull that started in 9th as Max Verstappen cut his way through the field, getting past cars when they didn't really try to defend because, let's be honest, there's no point. You'd probably have more success keeping a goldfish alive on dry land than you would defending from the Red Bulls. But once we did get going, there were a couple of nice little battles going on. We had Leclerc and Magnussen 3 times in this race where Leclerc got by Magnussen and then Magnussen got back through. Just remember that 1 year ago Leclerc was fighting Verstappen for the win at this venue, and now he's fighting to keep a Haas car behind him. We did also see some people moving through the field, such as Lewis Hamilton starting down in 13th place and making his way, making some progress later on the medium tyres, because in the first half of the race he was one of the cars, including most of the back half of the grid, that was stuck behind Valtteri Bottas. And I think that's where we saw one of the problems that we're having at the moment in F1, where cars are suddenly again starting to find it hard to overtake each other, especially when most of them are on the same or worse tyres. Most cars started the race on mediums, a few on hards that were out of position. You look at Hamilton, Verstappen, and then there was Joe and Hülkenberg just going a bit rogue. But we only really saw a lot of overtakes coming later on in the race when people were on mediums versus people on hards, and I think the key here is there's not enough pace advantage in those mediums to really give you a push and an edge over people starting on the hard tyres. Ultimately, that's probably where this race has suffered just a little bit, in the fact that every single car went for a one-stop strategy, and even those people that started on soft tyres changed to hard like 6 laps in and went the rest of the race on them. Now with this series, I do like to get you guys involved, and so I do put out a poll after each race. Apologies, it was a little late this time. I may have been busy and forgot to do it immediately, but hey, I still did. And from that, you guys have given it a 5.6, which if you've watched my Nikita Mazepin video, and let's be honest, if you're watching this, you probably have, then you'll know that I'd rate that as kinda meh. And that's because it sits pretty much bang average in the middle of all the ratings you can give it, and looking back on the race, I'd say that's probably about right. For me personally though, I've gone slightly higher with a 6, as when I look back at it and on the whole I did feel like it was pretty average in that sort of 5, maybe 6 range. There were a number of sort of nice little individual battles. You know, you look at say Leclerc and Magnussen, or Hamilton coming through, Alonso Sainz at one point until he messed it up with the pit stop, which to be fair at least it wasn't the strategist messing it up for a change. But still there were a nice few little battles in there when I look back, and that gives it just that little bump up from a 5, 5.5 to a 6 for me. First up then, the McLaren team, and to say it was a disappointing Sunday is very much an understatement. I'll start with the worst of the two drives, if you can have the worst of two bad weekends, and it's Oscar Piastri, finishing down in 19th place. The only driver he finished ahead of was Logan Sargeant, and that really tells you all you need to know. In fairness to Oscar, he did have troubles with the brakes pretty early on, and he started on the soft tyres, which was always a bad strategy, having to change over to the hards pretty early. So combined basically a pretty poor strategy, along with a long brake pedal costing him time, meant that he was only ever going to be towards the back in this one. From the timings, it definitely looked to be affecting him, so I don't think it's really too fair to give him a rating considering he wasn't fighting anyone all race and he was in a poor car, and by that I don't just mean he was in a McLaren, so for Oscar it's going to be a not applicable. Next up, Lando Norris, who started down in 16th place after being knocked out in Q1, something that he's not really used to, but as he's in a McLaren should probably start getting used to. But for him, it didn't go very well at turn 1 as Nick de Vries ploughed into the back of him after the AlphaTauri driver locked up, which sent Norris wide and towards the back of the pack. That's not really his fault, and neither is starting on the softs like his teammate, a terrible decision from McLaren there, and it meant that early on he had to pit, was well behind a lot of people, and only managed to finish up in 17th. Beating his teammate Logan Sargeant and Nick de Vries, and when you consider that Nick de Vries and Sargeant are two of those and the only other one is Piastri, so you've only beaten the three rookies, not a great Sunday. I think for Lando, as far as I'm aware, other than being hit at the back, there wasn't any issues ongoing throughout the race. I may be wrong, but even so for him it's pretty disappointing. So for Lando in Miami, I think it's probably going to be a 4. Next up then is the Williams team, and it's a tale of two halves of them, with one half being disappointing, and that's Logan Sargeant in his home race. From Fort Lauderdale in Florida, the local kid did not have the best of Sundays, clipping Lance Stroll on the opening lap and sending him to the back of the pack, having to pit for a new front wing, also compromising his strategy, taking him off the medium tyres and straight onto the hards for the rest of the race. And if you look at the timings, he was roughly 20 odd seconds behind a lot of the cars early on, and then finished the race approximately 34 seconds behind the first car that wasn't Piastri, who had a load of brake issues. So when you look at his race in total, he's hit Lance Stroll on the opening lap, damaged his front wing, compromised his strategy, and then been off the pace for the rest of it. I guess one positive you can take away is that he hasn't lost any places, though he did start in last, so that was kind of impossible. I think for Logan in this one, it's going to be a 2.5. Next up then, Alex Albon, who had the better weekend or the better Sunday of the two Williams drivers, but still nothing to write home about. Starting off losing a place pretty early on, however after that only lost a couple more and eventually finished in 14th. Unfortunately for Alex, he found himself caught behind Valtteri Bottas for a lot of the time, however did start to slip back a little bit and ultimately was overtaken by Yuki Tsunoda. However, when you look at those 3 places that he's lost during the race, 2 of them are Lance Stroll and Lewis Hamilton, so the only real person that he's lost out to is Yuki Tsunoda, who's been performing fairly well this year. Still, for Alex, I think we've come to expect bigger things, even for him in a Williams car, so I think overall it's probably going to be a grade of a 5, just about average is what I give it. He's lost places, one to someone that he maybe would have liked to stay ahead of, but ultimately he's not done badly. So onto what I would call the most meh team on the grid, and that's Alfa Romeo. I'm going to start with Valtteri Bottas, who is also possibly the most meh driver on the grid, to give you the ultimate meh combination. And with Valtteri for this one, I think it was pretty clear early on that Alfa Romeo just didn't have the pace. You know, he did qualify up in the top 10 after getting into Q3, didn't set a lap because of, well, Charles Leclerc being unable to turn left. However, starting in 10th, it was very clear that he was holding up the cars behind him, including the likes of Albon, Hamilton, Tsunoda, Stroll, people in that train, and ultimately benefited, I think, from the fact that it was quite tricky to overtake in Miami. However, that being said, we've seen in the past that even on tracks where it's difficult to overtake, some people haven't been able to keep cars behind. Luckily for Valtteri, he was able to do that, and he eventually came home in 13th, which I think, given the pace of the Alfa Romeo and that everyone finished this race, isn't the worst finishing position for him. So for Valtteri in this one, I think it's going to be a 5.5. So on to Zhou Guanyu, who's probably happy to not be called Zhao Guanyu for a change while racing in America. And for him, It's a kind of okay race, I guess. He started in 14th, finished in 16th, one of those drivers getting past is Lance Stroll. However, the thing that stands out for me is that he was eventually on what was the better strategy, going from the hards to the mediums, I would say. And once he came out on those mediums, the only car that he got past was Lando Norris. Couldn't really get near any of the likes of Hülkenberg or Tsunoda or Albon, the cars ahead of him. And so for Joe, I think comparing to Bottas, it's probably a little bit more disappointing. So rating-wise for him, I think it's going to be a 4.5, just below average. It's not terrible or anything. Remember that Alfa Romeo is probably on average the slowest car on the grid. It wasn't this weekend, but in general, it's not a quick car. So now we move on to AlphaTauri, and I'm going to start with their resident Mazepin, and that's Nick de Vries. Now, there's two ways to look at it for this one. Number one, he did finish the race, unlike in Baku. However, this time he only went a few meters before crashing, unlike in Baku, where he at least made it 9 laps or so. And if you don't know what I mean, he locked up into the very first corner and hit the back of Lando Norris. Luckily for him, not damaging his front wing, although to be honest, maybe would have benefited from that excuse later in the race, considering that after everything was said and done, the only person that finished behind him was a injured Oscar Piastri, by that I mean injured car, and then Logan Sargent. So for de Vries, a pretty disappointing race. I think for me it's the fact that he did collide with someone in the first turn when he's had a bit of a problem with colliding with people or the walls this year. Not the best for him. So I think for de Vries it's probably going to go down to a 3.5. It's not horrific, he has made it to the end, but the pace hasn't been great and you collided in the first corner. Next up then, Yuki Tsunoda in the other AlphaTauri, and despite the fact that, he's a Formula 1 driver, one of the youngest there, he finished third in F2, the thing that he was focused on for his driver announcement was the fact that he was short. However, he wasn't short of a good race on Sunday as he came home in 11th place, continuing his run of finishing either 10th or 11th. That's the third time he's finished in 11th place now, the other two being in 10th. So it's a great consistent start for Yuki, and he's continued that consistency here in Miami, and it's really good to see. What I do think is a little bit of a shame, and I saw this on Twitter, was that as he's gone on his 3 years, he has improved and steadily got better, but his cars that he's in has also steadily got worse. Maybe it helps him a bit that his teammates have been absolutely trashed to start this year, but still for Yuki it's a good race on the whole to come away in 11th place, and he's gained 6 places as well. So as a rating for Yuki, I think it's going to be a 7.5. It's honestly a really solid drive, and as I say, that AlphaTauri isn't the best of cars. I'd argue it's probably the second worst, maybe with the Williams in general and the Alfa Romeo being last. Next up is the Haas cars, and despite managing to crash pretty much every practice session over the course of the weekend, they did manage to have a decent race on Sunday. Starting with Kevin Magnussen, who began all the way up in 4th place, the best qualifying for Haas in their entire existence in Formula 1. Obviously, he's expected to fall back there. You've got people like George Russell, Charles Leclerc, Max Verstappen, Hamilton all starting behind him. That takes him down to about 8th place, and then you consider that he's been passed by one of the Alpines in Ocon. To finish in 10th is a pretty good result in general. Also, coming away with that point is going to be really key, considering that there's only really 2 places available for points into the top 4 teams finish, so that point could be really key for Haas come the end of the season. Also, it was great to see him putting up a battle with Leclerc. There were 3 times where Leclerc got by and then Magnussen passed him straight away, all in different ways as well. One time he held it round the outside at turn 1, I think there was a switchback in there as well, a DRS pass, and he's definitely not giving up. He's fighting the Ferraris, who admittedly, they are Ferrari at a track where they burn through their tyres like anything I've never seen. But that being said, he is still fighting with cars that are much quicker than him and should be able to get past him fairly easily. So I think for K-Mag as a rating, I'm going to give him a 7.5, the same as I gave Yuki. It's a really solid drive in general, and he's expected to fall back considering he's in a Haas car. Then on to Nico Hülkenberg, who in this one was a bit like his chances of ever getting on the podium, and by that I mean non-existent. Apart from the fact when he stole the fastest lap away for maybe 1 lap or 2 when he was the first to put on the medium tyres, I don't think I really noticed him at all. There was a little gap from him to the cars ahead, so you're looking at like a Yuki Tsunoda, an Alex Albon, and Valtteri Bottas in that group just ahead of him. Did have the better strategy going from hard to mediums, but could still only manage 15th place, having lost 3 places from starting in 12th. Admittedly, one of them is Lance Stroll, who's in a much faster car, so he's kind of lost 2 places in general. Still, considering his teammate got a point, I know I only take into account the Sunday, but that points finish, is still a big difference. So I think for Hülkenberg, it's probably going to be a 4.5. Ultimately, you've not managed to keep very well up with the cars around you, your Tsunodas, your Albons, etc. But it's not the worst race in the world, and he's not fallen an absolute mile back like a Nick de Vries or a Logan Sargent. On to the Alpines then, and I'll start with Pierre Gasly, who, in all honesty, his biggest achievement in this one is not wrecking the car after destroying it in the last 2 rounds. For him though, he started fairly high up on the grid in 5th place, and has only lost 3 places in general throughout the course of the race, and to be honest, he lost that last one to Lewis Hamilton really late on in the race, and he really could have finished up in 7th, maybe even 6th if things had gone his way. But for Pierre, I think in general he's shown what he's had most of this year, which is generally good pace and being able to compete with some of those top teams. He's the only driver, I would say, out of the midfield group who we've seen battling amongst the likes of Ferraris or Aston Martins or Mercedes cars, and I think he really showed that again in Miami this weekend. So for Pierre to come home in P8, it's valuable points for the team. He's ahead of his teammate, he was ahead of him the entire weekend, and he's only really lost out to faster cars anyway. You look at Verstappen, Hamilton, and then Russell as well. I think for Pierre, I'm going to go with a 7.5. I feel like I've given out a lot of them so far. However, ultimately he has only finished 1 place above his teammate, and maybe he'd been in 7th place, picking off one of those top cars other than Lance Stroll. Debatable if you count him as a top car, but for Pierre, on the whole, a really solid drive. And then on to Esteban Ocon, who I can safely say existed in this one. I can't say I saw much of him. However, he did only lose a single place, with Hamilton getting by him, which is pretty good starting from P8 to come away in P9, and a couple of points for him and Alpine. And I think the fact for him that his race was with Hamilton most of the time, I think we heard it on the radio when, Hamilton was on the radio and they said, our race is with Ocon. I think that's testament to the pace that he was kind of showing. He was definitely behind his teammate and kind of solidly behind Gasly for most of this race. They were on different strategies, so it wasn't the easiest of comparisons. But I think for Ocon, it still goes down as a pretty solid drive. Nothing special or anything like that, but I think it's going to go down as a 6. He's come away with 2 points, which ultimately, in a race with no DNFs, is the highest that the best of the rest can come away with. Obviously, Stroll, was away from that top group, but still, it's a couple of points, it's a decent result. A 6 feels about fair. Now we move on to Aston Martin, who are now more accurately called Team Alonso, given that he's scoring basically all of their points, having come away with another podium. That's 4 podiums to start the year, and the only other one being a 4th place finish. Real top consistency from him, with arguably only maybe Verstappen, maybe Tsunoda in 10th and 11th place doing better consistency-wise. So for Fernando, it's a great race for him. He was having a battle with Sainz, where he saved his tyres, went longer, came out of the pits and overtake Sainz pretty easily. Sainz did have a 5-second penalty, but even without that, Alonso's finishing ahead of him. Obviously, was no match for the Red Bulls. They drove off into the distance pretty easily, but Alonso was pretty comfortably the sort of best of the rest if you count the Mercedes, the Ferraris, and the Aston Martins as that best of the rest team. Obviously, comfortably beat Stroll, but that's pretty much a given at this point every race weekend. To be honest, all Alonso has to do is turn up, and he's doing better than Lance. So for Alonso, it's another solid drive. It's what we've come to expect from him, and I think it goes down as an 8. He played things perfectly, managed to stay ahead of Sainz, didn't do anything wrong there, and the pace he showed was good all round. And then we have Lance Stroll, who really didn't do his Daddy's Cash nickname any favours in this one. Now, it will be said that I do always judge these on the Sunday's race, and so he's got all the way up to 12th place. And whereas the likes of Hamilton, who started down, Verstappen, who started down, all got up to decent positions, Stroll was the only one who didn't, especially when you consider where his teammates finished, and you can argue that the Aston Martin's probably the second fastest car. To be finishing in 12th place is just not good enough. I think it's really summed up by when he made a pass on Alex Albon for 13th place down into turn 1, and Alonso's just driving around chilling, watching the big screens as Lance overtakes. And I think the fact that we see Alonso being so nice to Stroll is simply because he knows that he's got it in the bag in terms of pace, ability, in every single sense of it. So for Stroll, it's a disappointing weekend on the whole, and even the race is a little bit disappointing for me. You've only really moved up 6 places, and these are all cars that are slower than you, all people that you should be getting past pretty easily. So I think for Lance, it's probably going to be like a 3.5. It's a pretty disappointing weekend qualifying, and it's not really a great race either. So now we move on to Ferrari, and starting with Leclerc on the plus side, didn't stick it in the barrier for a change. Pretty nice from him to do that, taking care of the team, not making his mechanics rebuild the car again. However, the rest of the race, a little bit to be desired still. As I mentioned before, spent a lot of his time battling with Magnussen, and he has only started down in 7th place, which isn't really that far away from people ahead of him. George Russell started in 6th place. Sainz was in 3rd, but running in 4th some of the time, I think. But even so, not the best from Charles. I think he just lacked a little bit of, I don't know what this weekend, but whatever it was, he didn't really have it. Maybe it was from all the crashes, maybe just backing off a little bit, making sure he didn't crash. I don't know. But still, to start in 7th, come away in 7th, and battle Magnussen throughout the whole race, a little bit disappointing. And so I think for Leclerc, it probably goes down as a 4.5. It's not terrible or anything, and a top 7 is still within, the realms of only being beaten by the faster cars or the fast cars when you look at the grid as a whole, but still not the best result for him. Next up then onto Carlos Sainz, who for a change was the lead Ferrari. It's something that we've said very rarely over the past couple of seasons, but for him, he'll be grateful that that was the case in Miami. Started in 3rd place and couldn't get by Alonso straight away, but did stay on the back of his fellow Spaniard and managed to get the undercut with his strategy. He did also completely mess up braking into the pit lane, locked up both fronts, massive amount of smoke, speeding in the pit lane, 5-second penalty, absolute slam dunk. However, even when he came out, Alonso got past fairly easily. Alonso's good at this, he manages the race so well. And Sainz as well, I think later on in the race, given how much the tyres wore away, and I think that was a general problem for Ferrari, never really looked like he was going to hold on, and in fact lost out to Russell. At one point it was, can Russell get within 5 seconds? Then it was, can Russell overtake Sainz? And then at one point it was even, will Sainz be caught by Hamilton? A lot of that to do with the tyre wear, but still a mixed race for him. You've got him definitely beating Leclerc, and I'd say generally being ahead of Leclerc throughout the race, but the pace not being amazing in general. So I think for Sainz it's a 5.5, I think is probably, maybe it's a little bit harsh. He has finished in 5th ahead of his teammate, but ultimately the pace was never looking great. He's also made the mistake in the pit lane, which could have cost him a bit more, but I think a 5.5 is still just above average for him. And now to Mercedes, and more specifically George Russell, who managed to refrain from hitting into the side of his competitors in this one, though it would have made the race a bit more interesting. However, for George, I'd say in general it was a fairly quiet race. The only thing that really happened for him was him passing Sainz. Verstappen got by easily, he was never going to catch Alonso, and so he was just sort of sat in that little zone behind Alonso and ahead of Sainz for a lot of the race, with Verstappen getting by easily. Hamilton started way back, so it's hard to compare the teammates' pace overall, and they had different strategies. But looking at Russell's race as a whole, I think he's done generally well, and I think he always looked comfortable, I would say, and he has made the one overtake that he's needed to and made it pretty easily and didn't have to, do much fighting or much battling to get by Sainz in the end. I think for Russell, it's probably going to be a 7. I think I'd put it down as a solid drive, but not jaw-dropping or insane or anything like that. So on to Lewis Hamilton, who is now known as the king of the I'm going to try and dummy my opponent into defending the inside line, as I'm pretty sure every single time he was behind someone on the back straight, he tried that little move. And see, for him, he spent most of that first stint stuck in the Valtteri Bottas train. He was really going nowhere. And it wasn't until everyone else around him had pitted and he was able to use up the life on those hard tyres and then the mediums towards the end that he actually started to make progress. But when he was making progress, he was really making progress, eventually finishing about 7 places up from where he previously started, and that's a really good result considering he started in 13th place. And I think as well, when you watch his drive, at one point it was like, okay, is he going to get ahead of Ocon? And then he got ahead of Ocon. And then it was, okay, well, can he catch up to Gasly? And then he caught Gasly. Can he catch Leclerc? And then he caught Leclerc with a couple of laps to go and finished in 6th. So having started, 7 places behind his teammate, has only finished 2 behind him and not too far off of Carlos Sainz. He was a fair way, but not a horrendous way or anything. I'd say on the whole, considering that second stint, it's a pretty good drive. Actually, I'd go as far as to say a solidly good drive. You know, he's finished 7 places above where he started, and some overtakes were really good. You look at the switchback on Valtteri as well. I think it's a 7.5, just near in that range of Russell, maybe slightly ahead for me. So ultimately, I think that's probably around about fair. And then finally, we round off with Red Bull, and starting with Checo, who made us all believe that he was actually trying to win the race for a little bit until we got to lap 20 and his pace on the hard tyres and the fresher hard tyres compared to Verstappen just completely dropped away. And he went from sort of 14 seconds behind at one point to about 18, and only really helped by a slow Verstappen stop, meaning that Max came out sort of 2 seconds behind Perez. Otherwise, they would have come out basically on the same place on track and it wouldn't have been a battle at all. So for Perez, I think relative to the rest of the field, the pace is obviously fine. Didn't pull much of a lead, it must be said, in the first stint. It was only sort of 5.5 seconds ahead of Verstappen after he sort of cleared through cars. So maybe his pace in general could have been a bit better, and I think that's generally a theme throughout the race. Still, I would say he's done fine compared to the rest of the grid, but comparing to Verstappen, who ultimately is the person he's racing this year, he has to do a little bit better. I think for Perez then, it's probably only a 6. I think the pace really didn't seem to be there, and especially when they were both on hard tyres, but Perez had the fresher tyres. You really can't be losing time to your teammate in those circumstances. And then finally, Max Verstappen, who takes his 3rd win of the season, alternating with Checo. And it wasn't easy from 9th place by any means, and I think in this one, most of the damage was done on pure pace as opposed to actual overtaking moves. He did have some really nice moves early on, you know, that double overtake on Leclerc and Magnussen, and he did make getting through the field fairly easy for himself. And often we see drivers, when they're in a faster car, they can make a little bit of a meal of it. You know, you look at Hamilton, he didn't have the best first stint trying to get past cars, but Verstappen was straight by people, even on the harder tyres, it didn't matter, was just slicing through people. And as I said, was only a couple of seconds behind Perez when he eventually got to the front. And from there, that stint on those hard tyres in the middle was exceptional. The pace was amazing, better than Perez, putting in fastest laps even on the old hard tyres. And then when he came out, it was a nice battle between the two, they kept it clean, and he did have to make a nice move. Perez did well to force him to do that, but it was pretty inevitable he was always going to get by. Starting in 9th place, finishing in 1st, to me isn't the big thing in this one. Ultimately, he's going to get up to at least 2nd with the pace of that car, but it's the pace that he showed on those hard tyres in that middle stint and making fairly light work of getting past Perez. Overall for Max, it's going to be a 9.5. You guys will be saying, why isn't this a 10? Well, because I say so. No, but ultimately, for me, 10's reserved for absolutely perfect races where you're just a million miles ahead, and he wasn't quite that far, but still almost a perfect race for him considering he started down in 9th. So that does round out the race ratings for Miami. Verstappen a clear 1st place there, 9.5. I think that might be the highest one we've had this year, joint maybe with someone else. Alonso continues his trend of really top performances, and there's a lot of like 7.5s. I feel like a lot of people had quietly good and quietly solid races in this one. Likewise, there are a few people who really didn't do themselves many favours. I'm looking at you, Logan Sargent and Nick De Vries. Really need to start to pull their socks up, those two. Also, apologies, this one was a bit late. I sort of just went through a bit of a phase of not really feeling like making the video, and then got to sort of Friday and went, yeah, I'll make it now. But hopefully I will be continuing this series. I do want to keep the series going. I just need to find the right sort of balance between my motivation for making it and also what you guys enjoy. You know, you can look at the numbers between how the different series do. So yeah, again, any thoughts and comments are really appreciated for this series, especially down in the comments below. But anyway, that is all for now. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you have enjoyed. If you have, give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Go check out some other videos on the channel. Check out the pre-race podcast as well. Links in the description if you just want to listen to me and some friends waffle on for a little bit. But until next time, take care.